Thank you very much. Looking forward to have this talk. It's definitely good timing because we're now in a place where, well, on-chain governance is running into some struggles with legacy governance, at least in recent news. So there's a lot of content to cover, so I'm just going to get right into it. First of all, about me? I've been working with blockchain technology for about 10 years. Started with Bitcoin, started working in Ethereum smart contracts in 2017, did some corporate consulting, startup consulting, that sort of thing. Joined OpenZeppelin in 2021, so ever since then I've been doing a lot of security work both with our audit team, especially doing project management, but also now working with many clients on security advisory, most especially Compound, which we started a security partnership with this year. So some of my clients are DAOs, so I've gotten to learn a lot about them. And then in my spare time, I also like doing policy work at the Texas Blockchain Council. It's kind of like a very small state version of Coin Center, trying to just do public advocacy in states and making sure that, we're preserving it on all levels, preserving crypto privacy at all levels of the Federalist stack. So a quick overview on what we're going to describe here. Really, when I'm talking about decentralized governance, I'm talking about everyone, all the participants are getting an equitable, fair voice in protocol decision making. I'm sure there are other definitions people can come up with, but that's generally speaking what we are talking about. However, this is really hard to achieve when the number of decisions that we need to make as a protocol or as a community continue to increase and the complexity of those decisions increase. It's no longer a yes or no, or maybe it's a which vendor we're going to select or what process are we going to organically come up with. And this actually starts to create a very similar problem that we've seen with blockchains, which is how do we scale this without compromising on security or decentralization? So in many ways, this mirrors the same challenges that have been posed by the scalability trilemma that's talked about with Ethereum and others. So we actually have to try to solve this problem for governance as well. And as we see on-chain governance, things like DAOs start to explode in usage. There's over 2,000 active orgs being tracked by a group called the Deep DAO right now. Many more than that, really. That's just the significant ones, the ones that we have good data for. So we really need to solve this problem because it's going to continue to grow. And we have to ultimately know what are the best ways to ensure that these systems are still truly decentralized and secure. So what am I covering? I'm talking about how do DAOs work, especially protocol governance, both for L1 blockchains, but most especially smart contracts, because that's what we've seen a lot in the Ethereum space. What are the common issues that are facing these organizations of security and decentralization at scale? And what are strategies to improve and help to mitigate these problems? I'm not covering are DAOs good or bad. I'm not saying you should use a DAO. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm saying it's a tool, and I'm going to give you some insights on how you can most effectively use it safely. I'm not going to cover political philosophy. I love to talk about it, but I'm not going to talk about it here. And then finally, legal considerations. I'm not going to say what is legal and what is not. It is simply just something that runs on chain, and you can decide how you interact with it yourself and consult with your own lawyers. So finally, decentralized governance, what does it mean? How should we classify it? Why do we want to decentralize all the things? And how can we do it better? So let's start with some terminology. And let's talk with something you're probably all familiar with in the Zcash community, which is implicit governance. And by implicit governance, what I'm really saying is decisions made off-chain. We're using some form of social coordination to decide, as a community, how we're going to change the protocol that we all rely on. This is usually coming in the form of an improvement proposal that is going to go through some form of social coordination, forum posts, implementation, discussion, and then eventually will be accepted by the network in the form of a soft or hard fork, or basically just upgrading the reference client. So examples are, of course, Bitcoin EIPs, such as Taproot, Ethereum EIPs, of which there are many, but the POS merge is obviously the one on everyone's mind. And then, of course, with Zcash, there are many zips, including the way that funding streams are determined. So this approach is widely considered secure and decentralized. There's a great article by Vlad. By the way, there's many articles you'll find in the citations if you want to go deeper on these topics. I'm going to keep it high level. But really, generally speaking, it's considered secure and decentralized because there's such a high degree of social coordination necessary to make changes. So very rarely will you see contentious changes pushed through because it risks forking the protocol. And that usually leads to the community being bifurcated. And in the case of both Bitcoin and Ethereum, which have suffered hard forks before, sometimes over contentious changes, it's usually something that no one wants to repeat. So ultimately, this seems great for security decentralization, but it doesn't really scale if you have a lot of decisions as a community that you need to make. So this form of governance is really limited to just long-term decisions, things that can take months or even years. For example, this is a good lifecycle for EIP upgrades. It came from an article by Hudson, diagram by James Hancock, and this just shows you how you'll typically go through, a draft of your EIP. You'll have to discuss it. You'll have to implement it. You'll have to get it tested and reviewed for security. You'll have to get it accepted by the community. You'll have to go through the last call where you're basically getting final feedback and making sure everyone's aware of what's coming through. You're slotting in for a network upgrade at some point, and then finally that change is live on the mainnet. It could take months, it could take years. This isn't how you want to decide short-term decisions, such as what grants should we fund or other things like that. You want a mechanism that's a bit more efficient. So that's where explicit governance comes in. And this is the idea that instead of having all of that decision-making really happen off-chain, then we're all in consensus by the time that changes actually go on-chain. With explicit governance, we're actually going to have the decision-making process occur on-chain. There's going to be some programmable process for how that decision is made and then how it is executed. For example, DAOs are obviously one area that we've seen a lot of this occur. So Ethereum smart contracts made it so that you could, with Turing complete language, program anything to your heart's desire, which includes governance processes, including how you manage other smart contracts. So we often see this being used in Ethereum for protocol treasuries. So if you have a lot of funds that you've collected, you can decide how you're going to fund development, how you're going to do operations, how you're going to do grants. You also have upgrades. If your protocol, your smart contract can change and be upgraded, we'll talk about what that means later. This is how you decide when those upgrades occur and what upgrades you choose. And then finally, parameter changes. Some of these DeFi markets are managing interest rates. They're listing different assets and deciding which assets are good to list and which are not. So really, you're seeing integrations between composable protocols, almost like deciding to do a merger, or not maybe a merger, but partnerships and other things that require some on-chain code decision that we can ultimately put to a DAO. So this reduces reliance on off-chain social coordination, so you have a greater degree of decision-making possibilities. You can kind of accelerate it because of the fact that you have this framework built that's on-chain, and everyone can understand it, and no one really owns it, at least officially. However, this comes with trade-offs we'll discuss later. But when we say on-chain decisions, who's making these decisions? So we have to actually split this up into a few categories, because while many forms of on-chain governance are collectively called DAOs, there's actually many different forms that someone might refer to when they say DAO. So first of all, there's just an admin account. You might have a smart contract, and there's usually this common standard of ownership, kind of an only owner modifier, where only a certain address, usually the address that deployed the smart contract originally, will have the ability to call certain functions or take certain steps. So it's not exactly decentralized, but it's the idea of there is an on-chain decision maker. And then you also have multi-sig councils, where instead of it just being one account, let's make it a collection of accounts. The typical multi-sig, where maybe we decide that 4 out of 7 on this multi-sig can decide how changes are made to the protocol or how we take other actions as a community. And you might create that multi-sig with most of the founding team, or maybe you add in some third-party community members so that you have a less reliance on one group than another. But generally speaking, this is kind of like the council will decide how the DAO will move forward. We also have signal voting, which is basically the idea of, if people have either a token or an NFT or something that represents their ownership or stake in this community, we can let them use that to signal what the community should do or what the DAO should do. So Snapshot is a good example of this, but in general, there's many ways where you can do signal voting where you have cryptographic verification that the person that voted did indeed have whatever credential we're using for votes. But usually this is kind of implicit because the execution of those decisions are still going to happen off-chain, usually by some other form in this list, like a multi-sig admin or a governor. And then finally we have a governor, which is a smart contract that really, I think, goes the furthest in being what many consider to be a proper DAO, which is to say it is truly where decisions are made. There are proposals that have to be put towards that governor. There has to be an on-chain vote, and then after that, it is then executed. So one great example of a governor is for Compound. They were one of the first, and they created Compound Governor Alpha and then Bravo, which has become kind of a template that's used a lot in the community. In fact, Open Zeppelin has a contract library that has also taken a version of that to be more generic for many use cases. So a good example of this is, let's say you have a proposal that's been created, and you put it through a review stage so people have time to read it and know what's it about. And then you go through a 3-day vote. In the case of Compound, it's based on token weight. So if you hit a quorum of 400,000 votes, then you just need a simple majority of yes or no to see whether it passes. And then once it has passed, you would then put it in a time lock. That change is queued for 2 days, so everyone has 2 days to see what change is going to occur. They have a chance to pull out their money or something like that if they don't like that change, and then the change is finally executed on chain. So, sounds pretty cool, but what are the problems? And there are quite a few that have come up as we've continued to learn and iterate and adapt, and maybe not always learn so well. So here are some things that can stick in your minds in terms of how to do DAOs and how not to do DAOs. So first of all, the security of upgrades is a massive area that I think DAOs are still trying to grapple with. Because really, upgradability, it's very different than what you get with implicit governance, where the whole protocol kind of has to agree that we're going to do something retroactive or break immutability in some way. There's now this upgrade pattern in many smart contracts where, while smart contracts themselves, being on a blockchain, are immutable by default, there are ways you can engineer them in a Turing-complete environment so that you can upgrade functionality, which is usually very useful, because if you want to add features or fix bugs without requiring people to migrate to a new address, you can preserve your state. I mean, this is pretty good. You'd like to have this for especially a protocol that has to iterate rapidly. However, this means that power to break immutability lies in the hand of whatever your on-chain governance is. Whoever the decision maker of how you upgrade now can potentially break immutability guarantees that you might have otherwise assumed were inherent in that smart contract. So one example of this, which was entirely non-malicious, it was just unfortunately a mistake, was when Compound passed a proposal, Proposal 62. It was made by a third-party contributor. It wasn't from the Compound Labs team. But there were members of the community that kind of gave it like a once-over, and they're like, yeah, this is a minor change. It's probably fine. Unfortunately, it was not fine. It had a very massive bug in there that caused an excess of $147 million to be given away in a rewards program accidentally. So that was a very, very serious issue, and it actually had to go again through that governance process to then fix it. So it took 7 days ultimately to get that fixed, or a little longer. So what we're learning here is really upgrades introduce tons of risks for secure protocols, and it also introduced risks for composability. We started a security partnership with Compound after this occurred, beginning of this year. And one thing that we came across as we were working on that was a finding from another audit firm called Chain Security that raised the fact that there was a double entry point with TrueUSD, which was an ERC20 token listed on the protocol for doing lending. Unfortunately, that meant that double entry point, which basically means there was 2 places you could have called the contract from, meant that there was now a potential critical risk that could have caused millions of dollars of losses if it was exploited in the wrong way. Luckily, we got it patched by going to the TrueUSD team and asking them to upgrade their own smart contracts to remove that entry point. So in this way, upgrades actually saved everyone, but you also have to realize that if they can fix bugs, they can also introduce bugs. So if you're integrating with other protocols, you have to make sure that their governance is not going to introduce issues through upgrades that are either malicious or just insecure through missing a bug or 2. So this is obviously a point that we have to be a lot better at. So another thing that we have to be very careful about is how we are going to distribute governance power, especially if we're going to use tokens. So on-chain decision making, we still have to validate who's allowed to make decisions. We have to be resistant to Sybil attacks and people that are just spamming a vote count and getting like Bodie McVoteface voted as the name of the DAO. We can't allow that. So we need to let someone make decisions based on some stake they have. And usually the way that many protocols have done that is through tokens that they've issued through fundraising, for developer support, through community members, through airdrops. And in many ways, it kind of represents a shareholder model, but without legal obligations, presumably. But it does give people the sense that you should operate similar to a shareholder, which is not always what you want for a protocol. Because ultimately, if your coin voting DAO is basically listening to the people that have the most funds, then you're kind of becoming potentially plutocratic over time. It might not start out that way, and community awareness can be a big thing to fight against this, but you do have this strong incentive structure to say that the people that have the biggest pockets are the ones that have the biggest say, and that's not always a good idea, especially when the incentives of the largest token holders might be conflicted with other things. So a good example of this was Solend, which was a lending protocol on Solana. It had some sort of token voting system that actually had never gone through a proposal before, but earlier this year, as we went through a bear market, there was a whale account on that protocol that, if liquidated, would have potentially pushed down the Solana price far further, and many members of the Solana protocol were like, we need to get this guy to like close his position. They couldn't get a hold of him, or he wouldn't do it. We don't know. And they're like, you know what? We're just going to upgrade the protocol and give ourselves control of his account, and then liquidate it for him, or close it out so that it won't cause a massive cascade of price pressure. So that was very controversial. They passed it. But then after that, they passed another proposal that kind of like went back on that to say, oh no, we're not going to do that. But suffice to say, it shows they had the power to do that all along, and that opens some very dangerous questions about how decentralized is this if token holders can come in and decide to take people's accounts. So ultimately, coin voting by itself as a decision-making matrix is not sufficiently decentralized. You have to have some other mechanisms in there if you're going to have token voting. But many DAOs today still continue to rely heavily on it, so we're still learning a lot about how that can be improved. Another thing is just operations. This happens to all organizations, but most especially DAOs, which is as you have a lot of operational needs, you have to manage your treasury and do budget approvals. You're going to have to do technical development and deployments. You're going to have to shepherd the protocol vision and discuss the roadmap and how do we stay core to our mission, the kind of stuff that always goes well in forums. So keeping up with all of that as a token holder, especially for these more complex projects, it can create voter apathy as you try to keep up with everything going on. And ultimately what you typically see is that some of these protocols have built in the capability to delegate to other voters of the protocol to say, you know what, I can't show up with my stake and vote every time. I'm going to delegate to someone else on chain that seems like they're more active in the forum. And that seems to make sense. I mean, that's how we've scaled representative democracy after all. But unfortunately then creates this principal agent problem of ensuring that we don't have a conflict of interest between the people that are delegates and the token holders that are the principals. So as this decision making becomes more frequent and complex, we have to ensure that we're building in accountability to ensure that the people that are representing token holders, or whoever is a part of the community, hopefully more than just token holders, that they're still accountable, and that the delegates themselves, or sorry, the people delegating, are still paying enough attention to ensure that the delegates aren't just running away with that power and making decisions that are not in the best interest. So we have to figure out how to scale this particular problem, and all of society is still working on it, so DAOs are definitely going to have to catch up. And then finally, we have governance attacks, which is the biggest thing that we've seen in the last year or two, which is really, once you have created this on-chain mechanism for making decisions, this might be an attack vector on its own. This might increase your attack service to the point where someone can use that to do something that you never expected and potentially either steal funds or disrupt the protocol. So, I mean, it can either come from bugs existing in the governance process or just flaws in the way that you set up this social construct. So one big example of this is Beanstalk, which you can kind of see with this diagram, where it suffered a loss of $77 million because an attacker was able to essentially push through a governance proposal that gave them control of user funds. I'm sorry, protocol funds, but a lot of funds. And basically, this was a proposal that they pushed through over a weekend. There's just a one-day review on this proposal, so they pushed it through over the weekend. No one really bothered to read it. And then once the proposal went for a vote, normally it goes through a 7-day vote process, but there was a caveat in the protocol that said if you can get a supermajority, 2/3 of tokens to vote yes on this, then, well, it seems we have consensus. Let's just push it through and not wait for the rest of the 7 days. But what happens when you do that is, well, that means that no one has a chance to actually see what's going on. And in this case, what the attacker did is he took out a flash loan, which basically means borrowing lots of tokens temporarily that gave them supermajority, and then was able to pass that vote, execute it, and then receive the funds all in one transaction. So this is the sort of thing we do not like, because this is really a clear way that DAOs can be taken advantage of. The more of the value that is accrued under these DAOs, then the more profitable these sorts of attacks will become. So we're going to have to consider how we set up permissionless governance when we're also setting up big honeypots. So that's all scary and terrifying, but how do we prevent it? What are the ways we can build DAOs to be resilient to governance attacks so that the protocol can continue to be considered a trusted place for users to engage with it and continue to build decentralized apps? Well, one thing is we can put safety limits on governance. This whole concept of checks and balances that we apparently saw as being a great thing in our Constitution can also be applied to DAO design. One obvious example of this is just longer voting periods. One day might not be long enough for everyone to figure out what's going on, so maybe don't let that happen. Don't have immediate execution on these sorts of proposals, so that even if you have a majority of users, don't just immediately execute it then because maybe people weren't paying attention. And then even when you have reached consensus or you've had a decision, put it in a time block. Make sure that there's time for everyone who maybe they weren't part of the decision, but maybe it's another protocol that interacts with your protocol and they just want to check that that change isn't going to impact them. Or just many other things where users should have time to know if they want to continue to be a part of this or not, if we want to truly feel decentralized and secure. And then, of course, it's also more time for people to raise issues, and you could still have the original proposer cancel that proposal or resubmit it if something comes up. So more time to review is always usually more time to ensure that this is safe. And also minimize government's control. So this is definitely prevalent in the current political climate right now. But basically, if you don't actually need to give someone control over something, like if it's possible to say, you know what, we don't need someone to upgrade this because we expect this to never have to change. Maybe it's an ERC20 token that's fairly mature or something like that. Then don't make it upgradable. Don't give it governance powers. Let it sit as it is as an immutable smart contract, as God or Vitalik intended, or something like that. Let it grow naturally, and then you never can be attacked through governance. And so this isn't always possible. So you can always try to just plan to minimize governance over time. Maybe today you need upgradability so you can respond to immediate bugs. But once the code matures, then maybe you start to burn those rules that the roles that have control of that and take away that power so that you never can have it used against you. Of course, we want to increase the cost of malicious voting attacks, so just making it harder to get a large amount of tokens and ensure that someone can't unilaterally execute a proposal without going through some sort of process. So for example, Beanstalk, what they did is they actually made it so that only once a proposal has been voted on and approved, only the multisig can execute it, which in some ways is centralizing it, but if you trust that multisig, if it's a group of community members that everyone feels comfortable with and you're not depending on any one part of that multisig, that's maybe safer so that you don't have executions that are coming through without at least someone taking a look at it. And then finally, just maintaining checks on voting power. There's been a lot of discussion around how to do DAOs better. There was also Optimism is basically building a kind of bicameral system for their DAO where it's both token holders that can vote, but also they're going to issue soul-bound NFTs, which is to say kind of credentials to developers and other community participants to also have a say in decisions. So you don't have to depend just on the token holders or bag holders to be the final say. So overall, if we're passing and executing these proposals, we should account for the security impact of each one. Once you create that power, make sure it can never be used against you and put in limitations and safety checks accordingly. Another thing you can do when it comes to how you secure these things is to create a process for how those proposals are proposed before they're even on chain. So yes, we have a thing on chain that makes decisions, but the off-chain coordination is still incredibly important. So this is something that we've definitely started to get really involved in at OpenZeppelin. We started this partnership with Compound to give them a lot of support in reviewing and auditing their proposals. So we're very involved with proposal quality assurance. Separate from us, they've also been doing things like formal verification and better testing tools for every proposal that goes through. We obviously also provide documentation on known security risks. So when they're listing assets, and that asset might be itself upgradable without a time lock or without any way to see it, and it has infinite mint capabilities, or it just has some weird stuff, such as the double entry point with TrueUSD, we can document that and tell users, hey, when you're voting on new assets, you have to check for this, and you have to make sure that this is not going to be a problem in your protocol if you pass this. So just making people aware of the risks as they make decisions. We also provide a lot more monitoring on the whole protocol. We've done a lot of work using both OpenZeppelin tools like Defender and Forta to basically just monitor on-chain activity, not just the protocol and the health of the protocol, but also things like governance. We actually watch for if someone borrows enough comp tokens or accrues enough comp tokens to vote on either submitting a proposal or even passing a proposal on their own. So if someone is going to do a governance attack, it's good to have that heads up of, OK, who here actually has enough tokens to be a problem? So definitely monitoring is very critically important. It's kind of like the bill alerts that you get. Whenever Congress is trying to pass something that no one likes and you listen to Coin Center because they said, everyone quickly start phoning your congressman, you would like to have that equivalent for a DAO as well in case someone's trying to push something through that no one likes. And then finally, having explicit off-chain rules, like constitutions, basically, to define legitimate DAO actions. The ENS DAO is a good example of this, Ethereum name service, where they spell out several basic rules in the constitution to say, we will never take a domain from someone If Google comes to us and pays us the DAO $10 million, we're not going to take Google.eth from whoever got it first. That's against our core principles. There's no way to enforce that on-chain, but by having a community consensus around what the DAO should and should not do, it's much harder to get away with that sort of thing because and this is a constitution that has been signed by, I think, 40,000 plus accounts that are part of the ENS community. So, in fact, they also require that changes to the constitution have to go through a DAO vote as well. So it's nice to have that, clear consensus on this is what the DAOs should do and should not do. If you have upgradability, you don't exactly have an on-chain guarantee they can't do something you weren't expecting, but you can have social consensus on how it should not be used. So overall, we should treat these proposals not just as the important governance decisions that they are, but also like code going into production, where we have security checks and a defined deployment pattern, and all these great things that kind of get put into this bucket of DevSecOps. And I was pleasantly surprised talking to several people at the Zcash community and Electric Coin Code, or learned that there's already a DevSecOps team working here with Zcash, so I think y'all are ahead of the curve and hope to see more of that with other DAOs in the future. So also, this is just a fun joke, which is to say, educate on proposal life cycles. Tell people exactly what it means to go from proposal bill on the Hill, go through whatever committee or forum post you're talking about, and then finally become a DAO decision that is executed on chain. So, I'm just a bill. Someone make that Schoolhouse Rock video, but for how you do DAOs. That would be really useful, or for specific DAOs, so that you actually, as a user, have some guidance on, okay, when I want to participate, what am I getting into here? What is it going to take? Sometimes it's not always clear. You have to find the right forum post that explained the process years ago, and it might not be up to date. So like having a little bit more education on that and documentation is always going to be very beneficial. And then finally, delegating operational decisions. If you are a DAO that is making more and more complex decisions, ultimately you're going to have to consider the fact that we need more efficiency and we need expertise. The average token holder doesn't have the expertise to decide how to audit smart contracts or how to do financial decisions and things like that. We're going to have to delegate that somewhere. So one example of this is operational units. This is a concept of a core unit framework that was first proposed by MakerDAO and is kind of a prime example of that, where they give a budget to some domain that could be a multi-sig or a DAO of its own or just one account that will do development or handle treasury or do grants or whatever domain that you want to allocate to it. So this is the typical splitting up your business into multiple units, but for DAOs. The other thing you would have is emergency multi-sigs, which is to say maybe the DAO in some decentralized way has most of the power, but there are rapid decisions we need to make. We can't wait 7 days to reach a decision on a vote. We need to decide now if we're going to respond to some security threat. So having that rapid response where they have limited powers to protect the protocol is also very important. Compound has a pause guardian, which can pause markets if they are going through some sort of a security issue. However, they can't stop users from withdrawing money from the protocol. They can't do upgrades. They can't even unpause it. It's up to then the DAO to decide, after we've responded to the emergency as best we can, what do we then do to go forward? So yes, you have this emergency power, but it is of course limited. So it's kind of you definitely want to make sure that we don't have benevolent dictatorships or the other thing. And then finally, there are some really interesting ideas around optimistic governance. The idea of, well, maybe there are things that we can let people unilaterally decide, but we go through a challenge window where anyone can dispute it and say, actually, no, I don't think we should do that, or we should put that up for a vote first. There's a really cool system built by UMA that we actually audited at Open Zeppelin. And they have this whole idea of optimistic governance and creating economic incentives around people making proposals around, for example, changing the interest rates or listing a new asset. And rather than going through a full vote, some of these decisions might be better off as, hey, if no one disputes this in 7 days, let's just do it. But it does, of course, require people to be active and show up and voice their concerns when something does come up. So overall, this is very promising. Like the idea of delegating operational powers definitely seems intuitive to a lot of people that work at traditional organizations. But if you've worked at traditional organizations, the caveat to this is that there can be more complexity, there can be more bureaucracy, and we're just going to have to make sure that we are managing that appropriately. So another thing is to consider, role-based access control when you're building this protocol and you're building in different little things where you're like, oh, I want this function to only be called by a certain role, rather than just making it all admin. Split this up. Say there's an upgrade role or a pause role, or manage the markets role. So if you create that flexibility, maybe you still start out with an admin having all those powers, but as you create a DAO that might be able to delegate those powers out to other individuals or groups, you can do so very cleanly and effectively and have clear transparency. And there's a bunch of tools that we built at OpenZeppelin to help make that a little bit easier. So finally, to take all the text that I've been throwing at you and put it into one place, let's consider what this looks like when we're talking about like someone implementing all these strategies, which is really just to say, hey, we want to build on a decentralized base, which is typically a protocol like Ethereum or possibly Zcash that has this implicit governance where no one's ever going to be able to overwhelm the protocol and invoke something stupid. And then on that, we can build more. We can build immutable smart contracts we don't feel a need to govern or change that form some core piece of our framework. But then there are other smart contracts that we will govern through a DAO. And then from there, we'll have multi-sig councils or smaller groups that will make different decisions that are faster or have emergency response capabilities. And then eventually we get to the point where we will delegate some of the operations for this to a protocol team or to a financial group or something that is making very limited decisions. But in the end, everything on this pyramid is accountable to the thing below it. So a DAO, for example, should always have the ability to pull back that power from a multisig or a delegated operational unit if they are misbehaving or not doing not doing things that they were set out to do properly. So having that accountability, much in the way that an executive should technically have it to something like Congress, is kind of a principle that we can think about when we build DAOs, but also with this immutable concept of both, a protocol that is completely immutable because it's a layer one with a big, massive decentralized network, and then immutable smart contracts that are unchangeable because we feel comfortable and we can. So we can look at this with DAO or the compound DAO, and this is one example where we have, it's built on Ethereum. It has a governance token called comp that is completely immutable. There's no admin role. You can't mint more. You couldn't pause it, you couldn't do anything to it, which is good because this is a token we use to govern the protocol. So not having powers behind it does give a little bit more safety to how you then use it to vote on governance proposals that go through Compound Governor. And then from there, we have multi-sig councils. So a pause guardian exists, like I said. There's also discussions to create a grant committee, which will be built on a multi-sig. And then we also have both the Compound Labs team doing protocol development. We have Gauntlet that actually does financial risk management for Compound. And then we have OpenZeppelin, which is where we offer security services and advice. So going forward, what could this mean for Zcash? Not a lot of on-chain governance exists with Zcash, and I think that's for good reasons because you don't want to move into that too quickly. And it's a layer one, so it's considered that most of the stuff happening on a layer one usually should just remain implicit to avoid any issues with the on-chain process undermining its security or decentralization. However, there is this 20% of mining rewards of funding that is being allocated to specific orgs. And in many ways, these are already operational units operating on behalf of the community. But there's been constant discussion around should we have some form of on-chain governance. Maybe the Zcash Community Advisory Panel could have some way to do signal voting on what they want the grant community to do. And a lot of other things like this. So I'm not here to say you should do any one specific thing. I am here to say if you're considering it, this is kind of maybe the way to conceptually think about it, where the on-chain governance system is there to give the operational units some broader decentralized accountability, but it's not necessary. It shouldn't be there to replace what protocol governance already does in terms of keeping the protocol itself secure. So going forward, how do we think about DAOs? Well, they're still incredibly new. They're still going to require continuous iteration. And so when you're designing a DAO or building a system like that, you need to think of it in the same adversarial mindset that we all think about building blockchain protocols today. Any permissionless system might be attacked, and we need to both build it with a lot of security built in from the start and also actively monitor it to ensure it's behaving and if there are issues that come up that we need to fix. So I put this diagram of the Ethereum layer 2s that are seeing a lot of traction because we've seen rollups like Arbitrum and Optimism that now have over $1 billion in total value locked. And the idea is we're going to scale Ethereum through rollups. That is the roadmap that we've essentially been building towards in the last year or two. We're still going to have to do some dank sharding on the main Ethereum chain. But the idea is rollups are really going to be shouldering the burden, and they're going to be the place where rapid iteration is occurring. Especially once we've gotten through the really tough parts of our scaling roadmap. However, if you see here, the way that these systems are built today is many of them are upgradable. That is to say, there is one account or maybe a small number of accounts that can decide if they're going to upgrade the contracts on Ethereum that actually provide the security and decentralization of these rollups. And this is for a good reason. these are new things. These have only been out for a year or two, and the teams behind these want to have the ability to quickly and rapidly respond to security threats that come up, and upgradability is one way to do it. However, over time, if we really want to treat these things as decentralized or secure, we're going to have to make sure that upgradability is both managed properly and potentially decentralized over time, where that authority is maybe delegated to a multi-sig. You can see actually zkSync has a multi-sig. It has you can have a time lock, these sorts of things. And then maybe at some point we can burn that upgrade role because we've reached that mature stage where we feel comfortable letting the code remain immutable. So if you're building DAOs or considering DAOs, I would say start small and carefully consider how to distribute governance power, because once you do that, there's no going back. And scale decision-making through some sort of delegation of authority that is still revocable and accountable to the community as a whole. So that's it for the main content, so ready for questions.
A few questions for you. What role will or should reputation play in Web3 governance going forward?
Ooh, that's a good one. Many different ways it could do it. I think the idea is that things like NFTs or soul-bound tokens that people have discussed is one way to do it as a starting point. That's where optimism's going, is to say if someone has reputation in the community that we can capture in some way, then that can be something that reaches a threshold for, okay, this person should participate in decisions. How much weight their decisions have versus others is where things might get tricky. But I like the idea that some people have thrown out of like, hey, maybe you could do a POAP at different community events, and if you have gotten a certain number of POAPs, then you get to be part of the decision-making process for where the next event is, if we want to start small, but maybe even grow it from there, because if someone shows up to an event, whether virtual or in person, and you can give them an NFT that kind of represents the fact that they did that, then you can kind of build a base for reputation that people can recognize. If someone goes to every Zcon, they probably have Zcash's community interests in mind, or very likely, but there's probably other things we'd have to do as well.
Are there times when normal governance procedures should be bypassed for an emergency like a chain stoppage?
Ooh, okay, yeah. So that gets, I guess, into emergency multisigs and how you should do them. And this is actually a problem that we've thought about with both Compound and others, where it's like, okay, the pause guardian has some powers, but we try to limit that to a certain extent, because if we give it too much power, then it feels like it could just override the DAO, and the DAO is kind of redundant. So it's very difficult to decide how exactly you should do that. It's always usually a trade-off in the end. I think Compound made the right trade-off of just saying, you know what, we're going to be able to pause as much as we can without having too much power. And then at that point, we're just going to have to, the DAO is just going to have to figure out then how to do the rest. So I think there could be more complex mechanisms built that will allow more rapid response without compromising decentralization. But it is probably going to take a lot of time to figure that out.
Great. This is probably a bit of an unfair question, since you mentioned at the start you weren't going to talk about political philosophy. But somebody asked it, so I'll ask, and feel free to decline to respond. But what are your thoughts on political philosophy and how it might apply?
Okay, so it's a lot I could say. I would say I like political philosophy, so I definitely put it into how I think about DAOs. I think what we're seeing here is a way that you can do decentralized governance that kind of harkens back to promises we've seen throughout history. This whole idea of like a tribal culture, and then the idea of creating communes or Soviets, or things that we've seen in history that started out decentralized at their core, that was like a mass movement of people, but over time it was somehow co-opted. It became a centralized thing. The Soviets that were trying to create the Russian Revolution and work for the workers ended up turning into the Soviet Union, where the Communist Party had complete control, and they basically were able to run the show, and it was worse for many of the workers than it was actually before, when they had a totalitarian regime. It just swapped, but claiming to represent the people. So from a political philosophy standpoint, there's a lot of things to dig in there, but I think the challenge for DAOs is to figure out how to build things that are decentralized and secure without falling into those traps we've seen throughout history. I think the one thing that gives me hope is the fact that the amount of transparency and the ability to coordinate on just blockchains in general gives us way more tooling than we've ever had before to transparently understand what's going on and decide. But how we distribute governance power and then how we keep it distributed is going to be ultimately the biggest challenge.
So you mentioned Zcash governance. You showed that slide that showed the current state of governance. Are there any warnings or kind of things that specific to the way we're currently set up that as we looked at further decentralization and what comes in the future, that you've learned that would be applied to our specific situation, or maybe if not specific, a little more general things to consider that maybe you haven't mentioned yet.
Gotcha. Good question. So I'm still a bit of a neophyte when it comes to Zcash governance, but I did a lot of reading ahead of time to try to get my head straight. From what I've seen, I mean, there's obviously a novel approach of having protocol funding coming through block rewards that Zcash has kind of been famous for. And I think the fact that y'all didn't jump into on-chain governance immediately is probably a good thing, because it does come with a lot of careful learning. So I think the fact that now there's these operational entities that are able to handle that funding in a way that is familiar to people, like we know how nonprofits work if we can set them up properly. So I would say going forward, one, I don't think you should mess with the upgradability of the protocol itself. I think that should remain implicit in the sense that there's no DAO that decides or token holders that decide. It's just going to continue to be nodes reaching social consensus. But the way that you decide how funding is done, or maybe the way that you decide who decides how funding is done, would be a good starting point to start to build in these systems. And even then, it doesn't have to be binding. You can build governance systems like signal voting, where you can authenticate that people say they want this, and then leave it to a group to decide how they're going to interpret that. Many people have problems with the sorts of DAOs that say, oh, we have snapshot voting within the multisig decides. There's a lot of protocols that do that on Ethereum. But I think there's some merit to that as long as it's clear what they're doing, which is to say, if you reject what the snapshot says, if the community verifiably says this is the path we want to go down, and the multisig doesn't go down that path, that's on them to explain why they have essentially rejected the will of the community. Yeah, the DAO is not going to enforce that on them, but in some cases there's going to be there's still a social fabric for that community that is going to rely on that multisig either working with the snapshot consensus or justifying why they're not, and that justification will probably be a high bar.
Awesome. Well, I want to personally say thank you. These are concepts that my colleague Dan and I talk about frequently, and we've done a huge amount of research, and in your presentation, had we found this 6 months ago, would have saved us a great deal of time. So really appreciate the comprehensive presentation and the very clear explanation. So thank you.
Thank you.